Ja näin ohjelma kuuluu. Kyllä, ohjelma jatkuu saman tein vähän lyhyemmän tauon jälkeen, mutta siitä huolimatta täysillä mennään. Me kuullaan seuraavaksi talousantropologian professori Jason Hickelin ennalta ennalta tallennettu. Elän 80-luvun lapsena edelleen aikaa, jolloin nauhoitetaan asioita. Tallennettu puheenvuoro, jossa hän siis avaa käsitettä kapitalismin jälkeinen aika, mutta tässä vaiheessa sellainen pieni tietoinen, joka kyllä varmasti ennakkotiedossakin on mainittu, että tämän puheenvuoron jälkeen Jason on meillä virtuaalisesti livenä paikalla ja hänelle voisi esittää kysymyksiä, että jos jollain on mielen päällä nyt kysymyksiä tai herää tuon puheenvuoron aikana, niin sitten heti välittömästi sen jälkeen meillä on muutama minuutti aikaa kysyä niitä kysymyksiä ja saada vastauksia. Valitettavasti ei koko loppupäivää, vaikka mieli ehkä tekisikin. Jason Hickel on kyllä mies, jonka ajatuksia varmasti moni kuuntelisi vaikka kuinka monta päivää. Mutta pitämättä puheitta siirrytään Jasonin puheenvuoroon, joten virtuaalisesti siis. Ole hyvä, Jason Hickel.
Okay, all right. Hello everyone. It's a real honor for me to be with you today. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person, but I hope that our time together will be engaging for you nonetheless. So I have 20 minutes. I'm going to try to get straight to the point. I'm going to talk about the ecological crisis that we face. I'm going to argue that we must understand it and our failure to address it as an effect of the underlying structure of our economic system. And that if we're going to have any chance of stopping this crisis, and moreover, doing so in a way that is socially just, it's going to require that we liberate ourselves from dependency on economic growth, make fundamental changes to how our economy works, and ultimately transition to a post-capitalist system. So let me begin with just a simple observation. We're failing to stop climate breakdown. Things are really not going well. We're presently at 1.1 degrees of global warming, and even at this level, the effects are clearly disastrous. You don't need me to tell you about this. The extreme storms, the droughts, the heat waves, the wildfires, all of which is generating widespread ecological and social upheaval. We know that to stay under 1.5 degrees, global emissions have to be cut in half by 2030, 8 years from now. But so far, government pledges are nowhere near this target. Most people are not aware of this fact, but even if all countries uphold their existing pledges, global emissions will not decline at all over the coming decade. And remember that pledges are easy for countries to make. What matters is actual policies. And right now, according to the IPCC's most recent report, existing government policies have us on track for around 3.2 degrees of warming by the end of this century, which is obviously way over the target. This represents a profound failure of our governments and of our international system and portends a very dangerous future indeed. How dangerous? What will the world look like as we start to approach 3 degrees? Well, we know that sea levels are projected to rise by around 1 to 2 meters, which will swamp many coastal regions and coastal cities and significantly exacerbate coastal storm damage. We know that some 30 to 50% of the species on our planet could be wiped out in a 3-degree scenario. More than 1.5 billion people could be displaced from their home regions. And we know that the yields of staple crops are likely to decline significantly to the point where the United Nations warns of, and I quote, multi-breadbasket failures and sustained food supply disruptions globally. So this is why scientists warn that 3 degrees, our existing trajectory, is not compatible with organized global civilization as we know it. That is the reality that we face. That is the future that we are presently headed toward. And climate change is not the only crisis that we face. This reality tends to fall out of our dominant media discourse. But we need to face it. The global economy is presently overshooting 5 other planetary boundaries, including land system change, which is driving deforestation and habitat destruction, mostly for industrial meat production, excess fertilizer use from industrial monoculture, which is depleting soils and poisoning water ecosystems, freshwater depletion due to industrial extraction, chemical pollution, and most importantly, species extinction. Right now, the rate of species extinction is between 100 and 1,000 times faster than prior to the Industrial Revolution. When the latest UN report was published on biodiversity, the executive secretary summarized it by saying, and I quote, "We are currently, in a systematic manner, exterminating all non-human living beings." Now, people have a tendency to refer to this crisis using the language of the Anthropocene, right? And this, of course, this terminology is useful to highlight the fact that for the first time in geological history, human activity is dramatically reshaping our planet and our climate. But this language is also incorrect. It's not humans as such that are causing the problem. Rather, it's being driven by our economic system, namely capitalism. And indeed, economic historians increasingly refer to the ecological crisis with terms such as the capitalistine, which more effectively capture this dynamic. Now, it's extremely important to be clear about what we mean by capitalism here. When people think of capitalism, they often think of things like markets and trade, right? But markets and trade and even businesses existed for thousands of years before capitalism. And of course, they're innocent enough on their own. Who could be against them? But what distinguishes capitalism from other economic systems is that it's organized around and dependent on constant expansion, right? Perpetually increasing levels of industrial production and consumption, which we've come to measure in terms of GDP growth. If this system doesn't grow perpetually, then it literally crashes, causing enormous social harm, unemployment, poverty, et cetera, et cetera. Now, crucially, and this is key to understand, for capital, the purpose of increasing production is not primarily to meet concrete human needs for things like, say, housing and healthcare. Rather, the objective is to extract and accumulate an ever-increasing quantity of profit, right? That is the overriding objective. And this process has no identifiable endpoints. Indeed, the dominant assumption in economics is that growth along these lines should carry on indefinitely, that every industry, every sector, every national economy should continue to increase production every year, regardless of whether or not we actually need it to, and regardless of how rich a country has become. Now, the imperative of perpetual expansion might not be a problem if GDP was just plucked out of thin air. But unfortunately, this is not the case. Economic growth is a process of material transformation. GDP is tightly coupled to resource use. The more an economy grows, the more resources it uses. For 50 years, economists have been promising that more efficient technology and a shift to services and digitalization and so on will decouple growth from resource use. But in fact, exactly the opposite has happened. Over the past 2 decades, the global economy has become more resource intensive, not less. Right now, we're overshooting the sustainable level of resource use by a factor of 2, right? Which is the major driver of global biodiversity loss and other forms of ecosystem damage. Now, crucially, and this is crucial to understand, excess resource use is being driven overwhelmingly by rich nations. Rich countries consume on average about 28 tons of resources per person per year, right? Which is 4 times over the maximum boundary and far exceeds what is required to meet human needs, even at a good standard. So how could it possibly be that rich countries have such extreme levels of resource use while at the same time fail to meet the basic needs of so many of their citizens? Think of the 20% of children in the UK who live in poverty, or nearly half of the population in the US that cannot afford healthcare. The reason is because under capitalism, decisions about what to produce, how to use resources, and crucially, who benefits from the surplus that we generate, all of this is controlled by a small number of extremely wealthy individuals, right? The 1% who own the majority of corporate shares and who elect the directors of firms. And of course, what they do with this power is decide that we should produce things that maximize their profits, things like advertising in SUVs and fossil fuels, rather than things like public healthcare and public transit. People often associate capitalism with democracy, but in fact, when it comes to economic decisions, the key decisions over what to produce and how to distribute surplus, it is an oligarchy. The result is that we have a system that simultaneously overuses resources and also fails to meet people's basic human needs. Now, another thing to note here is that excess resource use in rich countries by the corporations in rich countries has clear colonial dimensions. And here's the key fact. We know that growth in the global north relies on a massive net appropriation of resources from the global south. And this happens because rich states and corporations leverage their power in the world economy to depress wages and prices in the global south, which leads to unequal trade relations and a large net flow of wealth from south to north. This is demonstrated empirically in several recent studies. Now, this has two major consequences. First, it means that the social and ecological impacts of northern growth are offshored or externalized to the global south. That's where the damage happens. Southern ecosystems and communities are effectively being plundered to support continued growth in the global north. Second, this process drains the global south of resources and wealth that could be used to meet human needs. And in fact, the net drain from the south is worth about $10.8 trillion per year, which would be enough to end extreme poverty 70 times over, 70 times. But instead, this wealth is appropriated to line the pockets of multinational corporations. So we're left with a triple problem. Capitalist growth in the global north is driving ecological breakdown, failing to meet human needs, and exploiting communities and ecosystems in the global south. All of this is true when it comes to energy as well. GDP growth is also coupled with energy use. And here again, the inequalities are huge. High-income countries use vastly more energy than what is required to meet human needs at a good standard, and vastly more energy than the rest of the world uses. And again, all of this energy is being used to feed a production system that is controlled by the rich and geared around maximizing profit and elite accumulation, not around human well-being. As a result, high-income countries also have very high levels of emissions. And indeed, we know that they are responsible for the vast majority, around 90%, of cumulative emissions in excess of the safe planetary boundary. In other words, the emissions that are causing climate breakdown, right? This is overwhelmingly a problem that has been driven by the global north. And they've effectively colonized the atmosphere for their own enrichment, right? With devastating consequences for the rest of the world and for all of life on Earth. And by the way, the impacts of climate breakdown, we know, fall disproportionately on the global south. The very countries that have done the least to cause this crisis are the ones that suffer most of the impacts in terms of human mortality, ecological damage, and economic loss. So what needs to happen? Our response needs to be commensurate to these multiple realities. Let me try to break it down a little bit, what's required. First, rich countries need to scale down their use of the planet's resources. And I mean this quite dramatically, by around 75% from existing levels. Indeed, this objective has been recognized now several times by the European Parliament. Now, our politicians claim that this can be accomplished through green growth. And the idea here is that efficiency improvements will allow us to achieve what they call an absolute decoupling of GDP from resource use, so that GDP can rise indefinitely while resource use declines. It sounds wonderful. The only problem is that scientists question the empirical validity of green growth narratives. Several recent reviews have found no evidence of sustained or sufficient absolute decoupling of GDP from resource use. And all existing model projections indicate that it is unlikely to be achieved in the future, even under highly optimistic assumptions about efficiency and technological change. And these results have been confirmed by scientists several times over the past few years, including in major UN reports. The conclusion boils down to this: green growth is not a thing. And the main reason for this is that in growth-focused economies, gains from efficiency improvements are invested to expand the process of production, which makes absolute reductions in resource use very difficult to achieve, right? So if a company, for example, manages to produce a gadget with 20% less metals, that's an impressive efficiency gain, which is great. But then it will use the savings from that to invest in expanding the production of those gadgets, so that the total scale effect ends up wiping out many of the gains from efficiency improvements. So it becomes clear that it's not our technology primarily that's the problem here, it's growth. And what this means is that if rich nations are to achieve sufficient reductions in resource use, they need to abandon growth as an objective for states and firms and directly scale down their use of resources. Okay, second, what about emissions? Now, again, if we're to stay within the carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees laid out in the Paris Agreement, then global emissions need to be cut in half by 2030 and reach zero by 2050. Several countries have managed to reduce their emissions, which is good news. But at present, no country is on track to respect the Paris agreements, not even the high-performing countries like the UK and Sweden. So is it possible to achieve sufficiently rapid decarbonization? The answer is yes, but not if high-income countries continue to pursue growth at the same time. The main reason for this is because more growth means more energy demands, and this makes rapid decarbonization more difficult to achieve. Trying to decarbonize a constantly growing economy is like trying to fill a bathtub that keeps getting bigger. So if we want to stay under 1.5 degrees, high-income nations need to abandon growth, again, as an objective, and directly scale down their energy use, just like their resource use. This is the most important principle in climate economics. The less energy the economy uses, the faster we can decarbonize. It is irrational to try to expand the energy system while also at the same time trying to decarbonize. It is much more sensible to actually reduce the scale of the energy system in order to enable a faster decarbonization. So this is known in the scholarly literature as degrowth. Degrowth scholarship argues that yes, we need technological change and efficiency improvements, but this will not be enough in and of itself. High-income countries also need to actively scale down excess production and reorganize the economy around human needs and well-being rather than around capital accumulation. So how do we get there? The first step, obviously, is to abandon GDP growth as an objective for the economy. And this is really not so radical. In the 1930s, the economist Simon Kuznets, the man who designed the GDP metric himself, warned that we should never use it as a standard measure of social and economic progress. The problem is that while GDP counts the total market value of all the stuff that we produce, it does not account for the social and ecological costs of that production. And it does not tell us whether that production is actually improving people's lives. So think about it this way. There's no automatic relationship between aggregate commodity production and social progress. What actually matters when it comes to human well-being is what we are producing, whether people have access to the things they need, and how income from that production is distributed. So instead of focusing on GDP growth and hoping this will magically solve our social problems, we should focus instead on what we actually want to achieve: good housing, good public health, ecological regeneration, renewable energy capacity, et cetera, et cetera. Second, we need to scale down ecologically destructive and socially less necessary forms of production. There are huge chunks of the economy that are organized mostly around corporate profit and elite consumption, and we would be better off without them. So instead of assuming that every sector of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need it to, we should decide what sectors of the economy we actually need to improve, things like renewable energy, public transportation, healthcare access, and so on, and what sectors are clearly destructive and socially less necessary and should be scaled down, things like SUVs, private cars, private jets, air travel in general, fast fashion, industrial beef, arms, et cetera, et cetera. We can also ban the practice of planned obsolescence and introduce rights to repair, right? I mean, if our products last twice as long, then we will consume half as many, which is a massive savings in terms of resources and energy and human labor. Now, most people would regard these measures as sensible, except for one sticking point. What about jobs? What about livelihoods? This is what every politician will ask. As we scale down unnecessary economic activity, won't that lead to unemployment? Clearly, such an outcome would be politically untenable, and nobody would agree to such a future. But this is where social policy becomes important. And this is key to the degrowth literature. As the economy requires less labor, we can shorten the working week and share necessary work more evenly. And the good news is that we know that shorter working hours deliver big improvements in human well-being, health, mental well-being, gender equality, et cetera, while at the same time drastically reducing emissions. It also happens to be resoundingly popular, right? So a huge political possibility there. We can also roll out a climate job guarantee. Such a program would ensure that anyone can train to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation: building renewable energy capacity, insulating homes, producing local food, and regenerating ecosystems. This would allow us to permanently end unemployment and ensure access to dignified, socially necessary work for all. At the same time, we need to expand universal public services to ensure that all people have access to the resources they need to live good lives without requiring ever-rising incomes in order to do so. And here I mean not just healthcare and education, but also housing, public transit, clean energy, water, internet, all the key goods that are necessary for survival. In other words, we need to decommodify these core means of well-being. On top of this, we need to dramatically reduce inequality and distribute income more fairly. And this is really key. Remember that national income is simply the obverse of the total prices of all the stuff that is produced in the economy every year. There's always exactly enough income to buy everything the economy produces by definition. So as long as we are producing what people need, then there is by definition enough income to buy those things, so long as the income is distributed fairly. Distribution is everything. And for this, we need policies like living wage laws, labor rights, wealth taxes, and maximum wage ratios. Taking this approach, establishing a firm social guarantee and sharing resources more fairly would allow us to ensure decent livelihoods for all and de-link human well-being from economic growth. We can pursue radical climate policy and improve people's lives at the same time. This is the bread and butter of a just transition. Now we know empirically that with measures like these, we can achieve a rapid reduction of emissions consistent with staying under 1.5 degrees, while at the same time also reversing other forms of ecological breakdown. Global warming would stop, the land would regenerate, biodiversity would bounce back, our planet would heal, and best of all, we can do it while improving social outcomes at the same time. This is incredibly hopeful news, a powerful antidote to the depression and anxiety and doomerism that has seeped into our society. But let's be clear about this much. None of this will happen by itself. It will require building a social movement that is powerful enough to unseat existing political incumbents or otherwise force them to change course. The environmentalist movement cannot do this on its own. It will require building alliances with unions and working class political formations, which have much more potential political leverage. And for this, it is vital to foreground the demands for social justice. This requires a big shift in mentality. For decades, we've been told that if we care about the environment, we have to focus on individual behavior change. But this is clearly not enough. Think about it. If you lived in apartheid South Africa, right? If you lived in apartheid South Africa, it would not be enough for you to sit in your apartments and privately be against racism. No, you need to get outside, you need to organize, you need to build social movements that are capable of overthrowing a racist society. That is the kind of mobilization that we need. Yes, such a movement will encounter stiff resistance from those who benefit so prodigiously from the existing economy. But that's okay. So is every struggle for a better world. And that's what we need to head toward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. I don't know if you can see us here by the screen. Jason Hickel, everyone, let's give one round of applause for it. So it's an honor to be here with you, even though I'm here live and you are there virtually, but still we are here in the same space. And now it's time for questions. So if anyone in the audience have a question in mind, we are here, or at least I'm not here, but Jason is here for questions and answers.
I cannot see anything, but I don't see any hands
someone
up,
can
but don't
just
you
raise your hand and ask away. There is one.
Hi, I'm Elina from Fingo. Hi, Jason. We have actually met when you were in Helsinki a couple of years ago. I was wondering, has there been any discussion within the degrowth movement? What's the role of development cooperation? Because the development cooperation right now, it's that the rich countries, which are, over-consuming, but they are also dependent on economic growth, but they are kind of giving small slice of their economic growth to the developing world to promote the economic growth in the poorest countries. But what would be the degrowth alternative for development cooperation or development aid that we have right now?
Right, it's good to hear from you. It's a good question. So, in fact, the existing narrative that we have about rich countries giving aid to poor countries, it kind of obscures the reality of the world economy, because what we know, in fact, happens is that growth in rich countries actually relies on a large net appropriation of resources and wealth and embodied labor from poor countries. So in reality, there's a net flow of wealth from the global south to the global north. And this is precisely the problem that degrowth seeks to address, right? Continued growth in the global north is exploitative of the south, and it prevents meaningful development. So what this means is that development cooperation should involve global north countries actively scaling down their net appropriation of resources from the south, which means doing everything possible to democratize the institutions of international finance and international trade to ensure that global south countries have a fairer say in the policies that affect them, allowing them to claim a fair share of the product of the world economy. This will probably also actually crucially entail or require global south countries to take steps towards achieving improved economic sovereignty using policies such as tariffs and subsidies and capital controls and import substitution to regain control over their own labor and resources, to direct that capacity towards meeting human needs rather than towards servicing the interests of capital accumulation in the global north.
Thank you. Questions? Now is your chance to ask question. I can come and bring the microphone.
Thank you. I'm Iris Laisi, and I'm really grateful for this speech you just gave us. I was thinking, do you trust the governments or the corporations? I believe they are not going to do this systemic change. Do you trust that the governments are going to take action, or is it actually up on the people, like ordinary everyone here and there, who is going to overthrow this kind of destruction we are causing right now?
Yes, I cannot emphasize enough the fact that our existing leaders have no coherent plan for addressing this problem. And we've seen summit after summit tick by with just failure as a result, and that includes Glasgow. The pledges made under Glasgow are woefully inadequate. I mean, they lead us to a very dangerous future. So I think that we need to wake up and recognize this fact that our existing political leaders will continue to fail on this. And what does that require of us? Again, I would emphasize that it requires building very strong social and political movements that are capable of forcing a dramatic change in course. Or otherwise unseating existing incumbents. And that's not easy. I mean, that doesn't happen on its own. That requires the hard work of community organizing. And I think we have to be very serious about that. Think about the successful struggles of social movements in the past, such as the labor movement in the 1940s and 50s, or the movement for women's suffrage, or the anti-colonial movement, or the abolition movement. These movements, or the civil rights movement, right? These movements took a lot of work, a lot of coordination, a lot of thought, a lot of strategy, a lot of planning, a lot of alliance building. And that's the scale of the kind of movement we're going to require, perhaps even bigger, to accomplish the kind of transformation that we need. So if I was to leave you with one message, it would be that, the importance of social movements.
Thank you, Jason. There is one question. I will bring the microphone so we can hear it.
Hello, I'm Upu from Elokapina. I've been also thinking about this coordination, this need for coordination, and there is shortage of those who have time available for coordination in the climate movement, and people need like role models of coordination. I think I don't have. I like, what kind of like role models, like books to read or people to get know from the history, we should like, read and learn so that we in the climate activists in Finland would like learn how to coordinate a movement. It's quite hard, and we need to like get this power to the heart. So who to read, who to follow?
Yeah, look, I think that one of the challenges that we face is that the countries that presently have the power to make the changes that are necessary, in other words, the rich countries, are precisely the ones where their citizens are least impacted by the effects of climate breakdown so far, right? And there's a real moral hazard here, right? It means that you need to act dramatically and very quickly on something that doesn't seem to impinge on our livelihoods at this present moment, right? It's a struggle for the future, as it were. And this makes the required movement a little bit different from previous movements, which were directly affected by the oppressors that they sought to overthrow. Nonetheless, I think that we can draw inspiration again from the movements that I recommend, that I mentioned, and take a look at. There's a documentary which you can find on YouTube called "Eyes on the Prize," which is about the civil rights movement in the United States. There's a book called "The Poorer Nations" by Vijay Prashad, which describes the anti-colonial movements. So I think that looking at movements like these, right, the anti-colonial movement, the civil rights movement, are examples of the kind of organizing and movement building that's going to be necessary here. And again, let me emphasize, this movement does not exist yet. Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, these have made big strides, but they're not nearly powerful enough to achieve the kind of transformation that's required here, a shift towards a post-growth, post-capitalist economy, capable of delivering radical emissions reductions. For that to happen, it's going to require much more. And again, I really want to underline the need for alliances between environmentalists and working class political formations and unions. Without that, I don't see success happening. So if I was to focus on one objective for the coming year or two, it would be to build that alliance.
Thank you for the question. I have one a bit more personal question for you, Jason. Sometimes the fight can be really exhausting and we need a beam of light to somehow to get hope. What gives you hope, Jason, among these critical times?
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, I'm a scientist, and so I draw hope from the empirical data that we have in front of us, showing that it's possible for us to have a world in which we ensure good living standards for the entire population, even a population up to 10 billion, within planetary boundaries, and with energy use compatible with staying under 1.5 degrees. To me, this is extremely exciting data, right? It shows that the doomerism in our society is totally unwarranted. That's hopeful. But let me emphasize this. Our hope can only ever be as strong as our struggle, right? So if we want to be hopeful people and feel positive about the future, we need to build the movements, the political and social movements that are going to be powerful enough to bring us that future. Otherwise, literally, it's just empty hope. There's no way that we can achieve the kind of transition that we need to achieve simply by hoping or looking at nice data. It's going to require dramatic political action. So let's build those struggles, let's build that movements, let's build those alliances that are capable of delivering the future that we know is possible.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. So at this point, we'll have to say farewell to you. But thank you again for taking this time.
Thank you so much, Jason, for being with us.
Thanks very much for having me. It's good to see you all.
Ja taidan
pitäisikö
tulla valoon.
Meidät? Jossain täällä me ollaan.
Pois pimeydestä kohti valoa. Ohjelma jatkuu täällä Tiivistelmän lavalla. Me ei olla nyt lavalla, me ollaan melkein lavalla. Vielä 6 asti, eli vähän reilu tunnin ajan täällä on paljon asiaa luvassa. Mutta me palataan
16.40 tuli tuolta, joo.
16.40 me palataan asiaan, joten silloin jatketaan. Kiitos.